Well, I recently rewatched The Exorcist, and one of the things remarked on was how well shot it was, and just the aesthetic of it was very well done and played out, framed and what have you, and performances are all good, and so it's more akin to a good film rather than just, well, it's a really scary movie, and that's of course, as I presented, I didn't see it as all that scary. I saw it as more to being really sad. And of course, my conclusion was the people were broken for various reasons, and this made them vulnerable to the demon. And so you see the result and what have you. But it was very, very popular. It was one of these movies that became an event at the time. So, of course, a sequel was inevitable. Now, of course, Blatty and Friedkin, they had problems with one another. They had problems with the studio. And also just, well, what do you follow up that with? Because really, Exorcist, I think, and this, you see this in, over and over again, is a movie that probably never should have had a sequel. I suppose you could do, well, there's another story of exorcism and try to craft something there that has its own narrative and angle to it to differentiate from the story of Reagan in there and all that. But that's not what they did. So it's like, where's little Reagan now? Well, she's grown up some, and they decided to follow up Exorcist with this complete and utter piece of crap. It's bizarre, and the aesthetic approach to it, it's just so far removed from the original. And now, granted, there were all kinds of problems that they had. In fact, the director got seriously ill, and they had to stop production for months. And then there were, reshoots back then. There's always been reshoots for movies. But this would have usually not to the extensive nature that they are today. But at the time, they kind of had to do this because of the problems they had. So I suppose that probably goes a long way of explaining the aesthetic nature of it, that an awful lot of the film is soundstage. And it's really obvious. And look, if the overall narrative and story plot, what have you, was credible within its aspect and element, and it was a good story, I would have easily forgiven the kind of tackiness of it. But it's like, you're supposed to be part two to this other film, and it's really jarring. And if you couldn't achieve that, then, well, so that's where you are with that, and that's the aesthetics is terrible for it. So you're introduced to this new priest who apparently was, I guess, a protege, played by Richard Burton, of Father Merrin, the actual exorcist, who is, damn near just a cameo in the original film. Here you get to see his early days with Max von Sydow out of the old man makeup, and showing his early days as an exorcist in some African country, which becomes pivotal to the overall plot. So Burton plays this priest who doesn't feel he's worthy, because at the opening he's encountering a demon-possessed woman, and he's there to perform the exorcism, but it all goes pretty bad when she sets herself on fire. And there's all these people that seemingly are holding Burton back, but he just sort of stands there. Nobody does anything as this woman awaits the flames to consume her, and he just stands there going, and it's, look, I get the point that it happens in front of him and he's shocked, but you got to do it faster, and they needed to frame this better to where doesn't make him look like an idiot coward and everybody else in the room, you know. Nobody tries to save this girl, and it's ridiculous. So he feels bad about that. So he doesn't think he's worthy of any more exorcisms or whatnot. But, well, it's quite a few years later since the Reagan exorcism, but the church has decided, hey, you need to investigate the death of Father Marin and get to the bottom of what really happened there, because some are speculating that he broke, Catholic rules, and may have even become a Satanist. And of course, Burton's character is, oh, that's ridiculous, and so he's been assigned to it, even though he's troubled by it because he doesn't think he's up to the job and all that sort of thing. I believe he was supposed to be, and I forget the name, but the priest that was friends with Father Karras in the original film, which would have made sense, and that's who they were pursuing, and they were going to get the same actor, but he wasn't available at the time. He was in some other project. So they had a few other guys that they were looking at to either, and they probably should have just recast the character. Apparently, at one time, they were going to go with Christopher Walken, which that would have been cool. But they opted for Richard Burton, who obviously was much older than the character was. So he was just a new character invented for the position, and just said, well, but he was still, a student of Marin or what have you. And so they went with that. So, of course, he meets up with Reagan, who is seeing a psychiatrist due to her ordeal. Of course, she has no memory of what happened as the first movie left it. She's in the care still of her nanny because the actress who played the mother didn't want to do the sequel, and, well, she was very wise on that. Unfortunately, she came back in one of the recent films, which looks like crap, so, but, later in life, maybe she needed the check, I don't know. But anyway, she didn't want to do it, and so they just said, well, she was an actress, the character was, so she's apparently off in Europe doing a movie, while Reagan's going to school and staying with her nanny now, who's there. And but she's also seeing the psychiatrist. The psychiatrist played by Nurse Ratched, although she's much nicer here. And then it gets really ridiculous. Now, of course, The Exorcist is you accept the supernatural and the idea of demonic possession and all of that. So there is that. But then you have to accept some sort of science fiction element here that the psychiatrist, with this strobe light mechanism, has made it to where not only do you hypnotize your patient to find out what they're thinking and get to the deep into their thoughts and all this sort of thing, you actually merge your minds like the Vulcans in Star Trek, and you can actually see what's buried in their mind and dreamscape and all that stuff. It's absolutely ridiculous and absurd, but this is the main. They could have just done a hypnosis thing where she turns out the demon is still buried in Reagan's psyche, or perhaps this opens the door to the demon coming back or something of that nature. You could have done, but here they go full on sci-fi and magic. Of course, yeah, again, supernatural stuff, but I suppose you could go back into it that the psychiatrist inadvertently stumbled into the supernatural, not really believing in it or anything, and thinks her device really works when it's really that. But whatever, that's the deal. And eventually, yes, this recovers the memories. Burton is able to join in this experiment, and he's able to see the death of Father Marin at the hands of the demon, and so on and so forth. Through that, they recreated. Apparently that was a body double playing the Linda Blair, the Reagan character from the first movie, because Linda Blair said she didn't want to wear the demon makeup. So was her stipulation for the film. So, all right. Eventually, Burton, and both Burton and Regan, their dreams merge, and it really goes to the inevitable creepiness that's there. Apparently, it was going to be a lot worse, and a lot of people, including Blair herself, balked at it. But nevertheless, Burton discovers that Father Merrin, early in his career, had performed this exorcism on this African boy who had this incredible gift where he could ward off a swarm of locusts. But the demon Pazuzu, that's the demon's name, took him over. So Merrin was able to perform the exorcism, free the child. But now the child is powerful and a threat to Pazuzu. So now he's got superpowers now, and maybe like an immunity to demonic possession. So he's all grown up, and he's played by Darth Vader, James Earl Jones. And Burton realizes, oh man, I got to contact this guy. He can help Regan and all that. So there's other scenes of the demon retaking Regan. She starts having nightmares and nearly jumps off the balcony of her apartment and all this type of stuff. So, oh boy, she's in danger. But Burton goes to travel to find this guy. There's this temple at the top of a mountain, and they have to climb through this wedge, and one guy falls to his death from it, and all. It's ridiculous, but that's what you got to do. To reach some old priest there who's supposed to be really knowledgeable in exorcism. It seems to be a colossal waste of time, but he's looking for James Earl Jones. Eventually finds him, and it's all very surreal. And then one minute he's in this temple where James Earl Jones sits wearing a locust costume. By the way Burton found this guy was the demon Pazuzu gave him a tour of the country by, I guess, taking Burton's spirit and having him ride on the back of this locust. You get the locust eye view, and you see the little locust flying around. And that's how he finds him. So right off the bat, it's like, why would Pazuzu do this? Because he's basically helping Burton find a way to defeat him. But nevertheless, so he does, and then suddenly it's all surreal, and then, oh no, and he has to prove that he's worthy or whatever and step over these nails and all this sort of crap, and then all of a sudden he's in this lab, and James Earl Jones' character is a research scientist researching on how to stem the locust swarms and stuff like that. Okay. So anyway, he goes back, before he leaves, and the old priest declares that Burton must be a Satan worshiper, and he's like, well, I'm not a Satan worshiper, and then the town starts to stone him. But his Vulcan mind meld with Regan is still linked, so Regan's doing a dance number, I guess for school or whatever. And then she starts to feel the impacts of the stones on Burton, so she collapses at the play or the dance or what have you. So, I don't know. They think Regan's had a relapse of her problems or whatever. And so, but Burton shows up, and they go on a little trip back to the old house. The psychiatrist is like, oh no, she's going back to that house. That could be very harmful for Regan. So she and the nanny take off. But then the nanny says, oh, that stupid bitch. And that was your clue that the nanny is also possessed. So they get to the house, and Burton is possessed. But when they get to Regan's old room, there on the bed is Regan. But she's all, well, sexed up and everything. So what does Burton do? Immediately starts making out with Regan, while the real Regan is watching all this and going, oh no, that's disgusting. And but demon power and all that. Meanwhile, her nanny and the psychiatrist show up, but they can't get to the house. The demon has done some damage and started a fire, and the nanny decides to let herself burn because she's possessed, And boy, the psychiatrist is like, oh crap, this is nuts. And so Burton finally is able to resist the demon, but he just starts beating the crap out of a demon Reagan. And then the locusts show up, the house falls apart, the floor falls out, it's ripped apart. It doesn't quite end like a Poltergeist where it collapses in on itself, so there's that. But then the locusts are there, and then suddenly Reagan figures out how to make the locusts go away like James Earl Jones did in his youth. Of course, James Earl Jones is, the kid who played him in his younger days, had this rope that he would swing around a lot, and that would disperse the locust swarm. Whereas Linda Blair here, she just does her arm in that motion. She did see the kid do it in her dream, so she just starts doing that, and then the locusts all just collapse at her feet and die. So, yeah, and then the demon, loses. And then Reagan and Burton, come out of the destroyed house, and the psychiatrist is sitting there after having called an ambulance for the burnt crispy critter nanny, and the crispy critter nanny is sitting there, and Reagan's like, oh no, and then the nanny goes, Reagan, and then dies. So then Reagan and Burton hold hands and walk away together, which, yeah. Apparently, that sort of thing was going to be even more explicit, and wiser heads said, yeah, nah, probably shouldn't have done any of that. It just adds more. I mean, I understand it's an evil demon and all that, but geez Louise. On top of all the just crap of the production and whatnot. Also, Ned Beatty shows up. He's a pilot who flies Father Burton out to find James Earl Jones, Well, you can understand after what he went through in Deliverance that he'd end up... he might have been a victim of possession. After this, he ends up working for Lex Luthor, So, poor guy. Yeah. So anyway, it was terrible. Just awful crap. And also just goes to show that the mother didn't learn her lesson. She just flies off to pursue her idiot career and say, yeah, Reagan, you're fine. You got a nanny. Yeah. But anyway, that's the last you see of Reagan and in the ongoing story and saga of The Exorcist. But at least there was, attempts at exorcism here. There wasn't any. There was a depiction of one in the past and stuff. But it was just terrible. And what is interesting, because the third movie, technically speaking, is called Exorcist 3, but there's no exorcism in it, unless you count the ending, I guess. But I'll save that for my review of Exorcist 3. So, Exorcist 2, really, there's only one Exorcist movie, but if you want to continue with them, then just skip part 2. And just think, they saved Reagan and she went off to live happily ever after, and ended up in Roller Boogie or something like that. Exorcist 2 has to probably is in stiff competition with other movies often declared as the worst movies ever made, and boy, it's up there. It's really bad. Really bad. That's too bad. Yeah.